But till reviews are conducted on far other principles, and with far other motives, till in the place of arbitrary dictation and petulant sneers, the reviewers support their decisions by reference to fixed canons of criticism, previously established and deduced from the nature of man. Reflecting minds will pronounce it arrogance in them, thus to announce themselves to men of letters as the guides of their taste and judgment. To the purchaser and mere reader, it is, at all events, an injustice. He who tells me that there are defects in a new work tells me nothing which I could not have taken for granted without his information. But he who points out and elucidates the beauties in an original work does indeed give me interesting information, such as experience would not have authorized me in anticipating. Those are words from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. And when I first encountered these words, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago, it made me wonder why literary criticism is literary criticism. Why is it? It seems so often, and this is in the age in which I came, or the time in which I came of age as a literary critic, it seemed that everybody had to sign. There's a sign-up sheet in the English department. If we're going to be a feminist critic, going to be a Marxist critic, what kind of critic you're going to be. And I'm not, it's no wonder that Harold Bloom, the great literary critic and probably the greatest reader of literature in the country for the longest time, why he calls them the schools of resentment. Because there's no joy there. And I think, that, in my own opinion, that's what happened to English departments across the United States and probably in England as well, is all these kids came into to an English major because they loved books and loved poetry and loved everything, and they're taught to hate it or taught to be suspicious of it. So, confronted with that, I thought, I don't want to do this. It's no, I can't do this. I love poetry too much. I love literature, even though there are things you don't like or authors you don't care for, or whatever happens to be. But is there a better way? Now, Coleridge was a poet before he was a critic. So he writes from the inside. He knows the inside game of the imagination. And I wondered, how could I come to a kind of criticism that we could actually use? In fact, I'll read you another quote. I might read a few quotes. Rudolf Steiner, of all people. I love this. I encountered this probably before I even encountered the Coleridge quote. But here's what he says. It's just right on the money. Becoming more and more logical, one takes to writing commentaries on works of art. This is a terrible product of a materialistic age. Scholars write commentaries on art. But these academic explanations, Faust commentaries, Hamlet commentaries, learned descriptions of the art of Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, are coffins in which genuine artistic feeling, living art, lie buried. If one picks up a Faust or Hamlet commentary, it is like touching a corpse. Abstract thoughts have murdered the work of art. So there it is. And so I thought, how can you do literary criticism without doing literary criticism? And another person who influenced me in this regard is another Steiner, George Steiner, in his book Real Presences, which I think it's one of my favorite books because it's the anti-literary criticism book of literary criticism. And what this thought experiment that Steiner lays out in the beginning of the book is, what would it be like if there were no such thing as literary criticism, if it were outlawed? What if the only way to write literary criticism were to write other works of literature? So then he proposes that Anna Karenina is criticism of Madame Bovary, and that Of course, James Joyce's Ulysses is really probably the greatest work of literary criticism of the Odyssey. What if we lived in that kind of world and not, the extraordinarily very analytical and some might say negative or critical in the most dyspeptic, I don't even know how to describe that attitude toward literature. Where's the joy? So, so with all these kinds of thoughts in my head, I thought, there's got to be a different way. And inspired by Goethe's phenomenology and by the work of William Desmond, I decided that the best thing to do was what I've come to call Agapeic criticism, from the Greek agape, right? The selfless love. Certainly there are, I guess you could say there are erotic elements at times. And we do definitely have philia in our filial relationships with the authors we love, right? We feel we can know them. They're almost like family. But in an agapeic approach to criticism, and this also comes out of phenomenology, you resist the temptation to come to an immediate judgment. It's like, I got you figured out. You're a colonialist, you so and so. But what if we resisted that and held off as long as possible making a judgment? And this, in Goethe's phenomenology, this is what allows the being of the work to arise. Now, Goethe, when his phenomenology was more concerned with botany, with color, with animals, with things like this. But we could apply that to literary criticism. What if we just shut up, quit trying to analyze and bring in our tools, our organon, right? Our tools of assessment. And what if we just listen to the thing? Well, we just let it be and be present to it. And I think this is a much more effective way to encounter and engage literature than coming at it with an axe to grind, with a dissecting tool. Isn't that what Wordsworth says? We murder to dissect, right? We murder literature to dissect. That's why Steiner said it's like touching a corpse. So what is it that happens in when we're reading? Really influential essay for me was Georges Boole, the French literary critic and philosopher. He wrote an essay called The Phenomenology of Reading. What actually happens when we read? And we don't think about it, but it's the weirdest thing. So say you're reading a work of literature or even an essay and the word I comes up. So you'd say, I found myself lost in a wood. Well, that word I, say you're reading it to yourself, it's sounding in your head, in your consciousness, and it's the only time that happens when it's not your own I that you have in your consciousness. So we read other people, and their I inhabits our soul space, we could say. It's kind of a miracle, but we don't pay attention to that. It's more intimate than sexual intercourse. The soul of another actually enters into us. So astounding. It's astounding to me. Now, another thing that Goethe described his phenomenology is in terms of reverence, right? In terms of reverence. Do we hold what's before us in reverence? How differently would we receive these words of others into our souls, depending on our own disposition? And we could say reverence might sound too religious for some people. Let's say allowing it to be. But here comes a caveat. Now, if we allow it to be, that doesn't mean everything deserves to inhabit our souls, right? So, there are some things that have a deadening effect on our souls when we read. I think, certainly government publications are right there at the top of deadening things that enter your soul and act as a sleeping pill. I don't know what it does. But on the other hand, other things are probably not good for us either, like pornography, which enters into our souls, and it can't not enter into your soul. It comes in through. Goethe talked about seeing beautiful things, whether it's nature, art, being nourished through the eyes. And we are nourished through the eyes, but we can also take in junk food through the eyes, which means even through reading, right? And just like with junk food, there are things we read that probably aren't so good for us, and in fact that are even damaging for us, and it can kill part of us over time. So those are things to think about. And so these kinds of agapeic gestures in reading, it's something you have to cultivate. And the best way to describe how it happens is to be present. Be present to the work you're reading so that it may be present to you. And there's a kind of reciprocity that happens with it. And it doesn't work with everything, but I think, and sometimes you have to come at things over time. You can't force bloom this relationship with the work of literature. Sometimes it happens kind of spontaneous like that, where we're just stunned, but more often than not, it comes over time. But I wouldn't want to decide what the rules are for this, because things happen how they happen. But one good example is from Simone Weil. And Weil, you don't know, had grew up in a atheist, agnostic Jewish family. They were culturally Jews, but not religious people. And she was a communist. But she kind of exhausted revolution and got disenchanted with political struggle, and she was drawn closer and closer to Christianity, and particularly to Catholicism. And while she was in the south of France, she met I think he was a priest who gave her a copy of poems of the metaphysical poets, and of George Herbert in particular, George Herbert's poem Love 3, which closes the temple. It's a beautiful poem. And what happened is she loved this poem so much that she translated it into French, and she memorized it. And she told another priest in a letter that, whenever she would feel a migraine coming on, which happened very often, she would recite this poem to herself. And she said after a while, it took on the virtue of a prayer. And then she says, and it was one of these times when I was reciting the poem, as I told you before, that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. Now this is like the best case scenario for agapeic reading. She doesn't have judgment, and I think this is probably in our own culture it's kind of a tragedy that kids don't memorize poetry like they used to. When I was a Waldorf teacher, Waldorf schools still do this, we would teach kids, poetry over the course of their life. They would really learn how to recite a lot of poetry, because when you do that, you stop analyzing and thinking about what the words mean, and you live with them, and they live with you. And that's what I think happened with Simone Weil. And that not only, and here's a bold statement, I think that not only allowed her to encounter George Herbert, have a spiritual experience of George Herbert, but likewise to have or even further, we should say, to have a spiritual experience of the subject of George Herbert's poem, which is Christ. And in fact, Love 3 takes place in a kind of imaginative Eucharist. And so I think this is what happened to Simone Weil. And she said, he came down and took possession of me. So I think this is something that's not really taken into consideration in literary criticism, because most literary critics are kind of, complete materialists, scientific materialists. But if you're not, I think you're obliged to think about what this actually means. What is this act of reading? And to take it seriously, but to be present to it. And that's the most important thing.